The mountains of Kunar province held their secrets close that October morning, but none as closely as what was about to unfold on a knife-edge ridge at 11,000 feet. The radio chatter coming through the operations center at Bagram Airfield carried an edge of desperation that made even seasoned operators pause their coffee mid-sip. 6 Navy SEALs, call sign Viper Team, had been compromised during a high-value target snatch and grab. Their extraction helicopter lay twisted metal at the bottom of a ravine, its rotor blades scattered like broken promises across the Afghan mountainscape. Staff Sergeant Kestrel Kess Thorne sat in the corner of the briefing room, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her flight jacket, while generals and colonels argued over satellite imagery. At 28, she had logged more combat hours in a C-130 Hercules than most pilots twice her age, but her voice rarely carried weight in rooms like this. Her call sign had earned snickers when she first arrived at the squadron. Kestrel, they'd said, the little bird of prey. What they didn't know was that her Cherokee grandmother had given her that name long before the Air Force ever did. Watching a 6-year-old Kess dive fearlessly from the highest branch of an old oak tree. The briefing room's tension thickened as Colonel Martinez spread topographical charts across the conference table. The terrain where Viper Team was pinned down looked like God had taken a meat cleaver to the earth, vertical walls of granite and limestone stretching skyward, with a postage stamp of relatively flat ground where the SEALs had dug in. The enemy forces closing on their position numbered in the hundreds, a mix of Taliban fighters and foreign mercenaries who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. "Sir," came a voice from the communications desk, crackling with static from the mountains. "Viper lead reports they've got maybe 4 hours before they're overrun. Weather's closing in fast and that shelf they're on." The radio operator's voice trailed off, leaving the grim mathematics hanging in the air. Major Hutchinson, the squadron commander, ran his hands through his graying hair. Every extraction option had been war-gamed and discarded. The nearest suitable landing zone was 15 clicks away through terrain swarming with hostiles. Apache gunships were already inbound, but ammunition and fuel could only buy so much time. The rescue helicopters that remained operational couldn't reach the altitude with the payload needed for 6 operators plus their wounded. Kess watched the satellite images rotate on the monitor, her mind processing angles and distances with the cold precision that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. The shelf where Viper Team waited wasn't a landing zone by any definition the Air Force recognized. It was barely 300 meters long, maybe 50 wide, with a drop-off that disappeared into morning shadows. The approach would require threading between peaks that scraped the clouds and the departure. Well, that would require the kind of faith that came from somewhere deeper than training manuals. The room had gone quiet except for the hum of electronics and the distant thunder of fighter jets launching into the crystal-clear Afghan sky. Time was bleeding away like hydraulic fluid from a damaged aircraft, and everyone in that room knew it. In 4 hours, 6 of America's elite warriors would become statistics, their names added to a classified list that their families would never be allowed to see. That's when Kess finally spoke up, her voice cutting through the defeated silence like the distinctive whine of turboprop engines spooling up for takeoff. She didn't know it yet, but those next few words would echo through Air Force legend for decades to come, whispered in ready rooms and flight schools whenever someone needed to remember what impossible really meant. The generals would stop their arguing, the radio would crackle with renewed hope, and somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains, 6 SEALs would hear the sound that would save their lives. The approaching roar of a C-130 Hercules flown by a pilot who had learned to fly from watching birds of prey hunt in impossible places. The morning sun climbed higher over Bagram Airfield as Kess pushed back her chair and stood up, her decision made. What happened next would either be remembered as one of the most daring rescue missions in military history, or as the day a stubborn pilot and 7 good men died trying to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, impossible was just another word for untested. Major Hutchinson's weathered face showed every one of his 22 years in the Air Force as he studied the satellite imagery for the dozenth time. The math was unforgiving. The mountain shelf where Viper team had taken refuge measured exactly 293 meters in length, according to the GPS coordinates they'd transmitted. A C-130 Hercules needed a minimum of 400 meters for a normal landing, and that was under ideal conditions with prepared runways and perfect weather. This jagged outcropping of granite, carved by millennia of wind and glacial ice, offered none of those luxuries. The approach angle alone would be suicide, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes muttered, tracing his finger along the contour lines. You'd have to come in at damn near vertical, then somehow bleed off enough speed to set down on what amounts to a glorified parking lot suspended in midair. Kess had been listening to this circular logic for 47 minutes now, watching precious time evaporate while the brass worked through every conventional option. Her fingers drummed silently against her thigh, not nervousness, but the unconscious rhythm she developed during her childhood summers on the Cherokee Reservation, when her grandmother would take her hawk-watching in the Ozark Mountains. "Patience, little Kestrel," the old woman would whisper. "The right moment comes to those who see it clearly." The radio crackled to life again, Viper Lead's voice cutting through the static with professional calm that barely masked the desperation underneath. Any station, this is Viper Lead. We've got movement on 3 sides now. Request immediate update on extraction timeline. Over." Major Hutchinson keyed the handset, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Viper Lead, stand by. We're working multiple options. Hold your position and conserve ammunition. Help is coming." The lie hung in the air like cordite smoke. Everyone in the room knew the truth. There were no viable options left. The rescue helicopters had reached their operational ceiling trying to get close to the shelf, their engines starving for oxygen in the thin mountain air. The weather reports showed a front moving in from the west, promising the kind of mountain storm that could ground aircraft for days. In 6 hours, maybe less, Viper team would be fighting their last battle. Kess stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and measured. At 5'6", she barely reached the shoulders of most pilots in the squadron, but when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years proving herself in cockpits where mistakes meant death. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer for the mission." The room fell silent except for the constant hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Colonel Martinez looked up from his charts, his expression somewhere between surprise and skepticism. "Sergeant Thorne, we've been through this. The physics just don't work. That shelf isn't long enough for a Herc to land and take off again." "Who said anything about taking off again, sir?" Kess replied, her tone matter-of-fact. She moved to the table and placed her finger on the satellite image, pointing to the western edge of the shelf where the rock face dropped away into nothing. "The Cherokee have a saying, sometimes the only way forward is straight down." The silence stretched longer this time, punctuated only by the scratch of Colonel Martinez's pen as he unconsciously traced the cliff face on the map. Kess could see the calculations running behind his eyes, not just the aerodynamics and physics, but the career implications, the political fallout, the congressional hearings that would follow if this went wrong. "You're talking about a controlled crash," Major Hutchinson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no coming back from something like that." "There's 6 men up there who aren't coming back at all if we don't try," Kess replied. She'd found her grandmother's voice now, the one that had guided her through every impossible situation she'd ever faced. "And sir, with respect, it's not a controlled crash. It's a precision landing followed by an unconventional departure method." Captain Rodriguez, the squadron's survival officer, leaned forward in his chair. "Even if you could somehow get the bird down in one piece, how do you plan to get 7 people off that mountain? The rescue choppers can't reach you, and you sure as hell aren't hiking out through Taliban territory." Kess smiled for the first time that morning, and those who knew her well recognized the expression. It was the same look she'd worn before every impossible mission she'd ever flown, the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read the wind like scripture and trust in things that couldn't be measured by instruments. That's where it gets interesting, sir. See, what goes down fast can also go up fast, given the right conditions and a pilot crazy enough to try. The operations center's secure phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension like a blade. Colonel Martinez answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. The conversation was brief, mostly one-sided, punctuated by "yes, sir," and "understood, sir." When he hung up, his face had taken on the granite hardness of a career officer who just received orders he didn't like but would follow anyway. "That was General Patterson at CENTCOM," he announced to the room. "Viper Team's mission was more critical than we knew. The HVT they were tracking had actionable intelligence on 3 separate planned attacks against coalition forces. The timeline just got compressed. We have maybe 3 hours before those fighters overrun our people." The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about rescuing 6 SEALs anymore, though that would have been reason enough. This was about preventing attacks that could kill dozens, maybe hundreds of coalition troops across the theater. The mathematics had changed, and everyone in the room understood the new equation. Kes felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before every combat mission. Not fear, exactly, but the sharp focus that turned her from a person into a weapon system. Her grandmother had called it hawk's sight, the ability to see the world with predatory clarity when everything depended on split-second decisions and perfect execution. She could feel it settling over her now like a well-worn flight jacket. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'll need a full fuel load, minimum crew, and a loadmaster who's not afraid of heights." She paused, meeting Colonel Martinez's eyes across the table. "And sir, I'll need your word that if this goes sideways, my crew gets listed as KIA in a training accident. Their families don't need to know they died because their pilot had more guts than sense." The silence that followed was broken by the scrape of chairs as the other officers began to stand. Major Hutchinson was the first to extend his hand, his grip firm and warm. "Kes, I've known you for 3 years and I've never seen you back down from anything. But this is different. You understand what you're volunteering for." She shook his hand, then moved around the table to accept the same gesture from the others. Each handshake carried weight. These men had flown with her, trusted her, watched her thread C-130s through mountain passes that existed more in theory than reality. They knew her record, knew her capabilities, knew that if anyone could pull off the impossible, it would be the quiet pilot who had earned her call sign by diving fearlessly into situations that would make angels think twice. "I understand perfectly, sir," Kes replied as she reached for her flight helmet. "6 good men are counting on us, and I don't plan to let them down." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "Besides, my grandmother always said that kestrels don't just hunt on the wind. Sometimes they ride the thermals straight up to heaven." The walk from the operations center to the flight line felt longer than usual, though Kes knew it was exactly 437 steps. She'd counted them on her first day at Bagram and never forgot. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows between the aircraft revetments where C-130s and helicopters waited like sleeping giants. The air smelled of jet fuel and mountain snow, a combination that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Her crew chief, Tech Sergeant Miguel Santos, was already at the aircraft when she arrived. At 34, Santos had more combat deployments than most pilots had training flights, and his hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent years keeping aircraft airworthy in conditions that would make manufacturers void their warranties. He looked up from his pre-flight checklist as Kes approached, his dark eyes reading her expression with the accuracy of a man who had learned to trust his life to pilots. "Morning, Kes," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of his native Texas drawl. "Word is we're flying something a little outside the normal parameters today." She handed him the hastily prepared mission folder, watching his face as he scanned the coordinates and flight profile. Santos had been with her through the Helmand extraction that had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross, had ridden out the hydraulic failure over Kandahar that had left them landing on emergency systems and prayer. If anyone could understand what she was about to attempt, it would be him. "Jesus, Kess," he whispered, looking up from the paperwork. "This approach angle, you sure about this?" "About as sure as I was when we pulled those Rangers out of the Coringle," she replied, pulling on her flight gloves. "Remember what you told me that day. Sometimes the book gets thrown out the window when people's lives are on the line." Santos nodded slowly, then folded the papers and tucked them into his cargo pocket. "All right then, let's go wake up some Taliban fighters and give them something to really worry about." He paused, his hand on the aircraft's hull. "For what it's worth, Kess, I can't think of anyone I'd rather trust with something like this." The C-130 Hercules designated tail, number 840212, had been built in 1984, the same year Kess was born, and over the years it had developed what crews called personality, the collection of quirks and characteristics that made each aircraft unique. This particular Herc had a tendency to pull slightly left during takeoff, a hydraulic pump that whined in B-flat when the temperature dropped below freezing, and engines that could coax performance out of thin air when pushed to their limits. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Pike, the loadmaster, arrived as Kess was completing her external inspection. Pike had volunteered for the mission despite having a newborn daughter waiting for her back in Georgia, and her presence on the crew roster spoke volumes about the bonds that held military units together when everything else fell apart. She moved with the economical grace of someone who had spent years working in the cramped confines of cargo aircraft, her hands already checking tie-down points and emergency equipment. "Ma'am," Pike said, falling into step beside Kess as they walked around the aircraft. "I've been thinking about the weight and balance calculations for this mission. 7 passengers plus crew, full fuel load, and we're looking at operating right at max gross weight for the altitude we'll be working." Kess nodded, appreciating Pike's attention to detail. Weight and balance weren't just numbers on a form, they were the difference between controlled flight and becoming a smoking crater in the Afghan mountains. "What's your recommendation, Sergeant?" "Strip everything non-essential," Pike replied without hesitation. "Seats, cargo equipment, anything that isn't directly mission-critical. Every pound we save gives us that much more margin for error, and something tells me we're going to need every ounce of performance this bird can give us." The pre-flight inspection revealed what Kess had hoped. 84-0212 was in excellent condition, her engines humming with the steady confidence of well-maintained machinery. The weather reports remained unchanged. Clear skies over the target area for the next 4 hours, then a front moving in that would shut down flight operations until it passed. The window was narrow, but it was there. As the crew strapped in and ran through their checklists, Kess felt the familiar transformation that came with sitting in the left seat of a C-130. The woman who had stood in the briefing room arguing with colonels was gone, replaced by a pilot whose consciousness had expanded to encompass 4 turboprop engines, 97 feet of wingspan, and the thousands of individual systems that would either carry them to victory or death. Her hands moved across the controls with muscle memory earned through thousands of hours, each switch and lever an extension of her will. "Bagram Tower Rescue 74, request taxi clearance for immediate departure," she transmitted, her voice steady and professional. The response came back crisp and clear: priority clearance, runway 21, winds favorable for takeoff. As 840212 rolled toward the runway, Kess caught sight of Colonel Martinez standing outside the operations center, his hand raised in a subtle salute. Other personnel had gathered to watch their departure: maintenance crews, intelligence officers, even some of the Taliban detainees from the holding facility, their faces pressed against the wire mesh windows of their cells. Word had spread through the base with the speed that only truly dangerous missions achieved. The takeoff was routine until it wasn't. As Kess rotated the aircraft off the runway and began the climbing turn toward Kunar province, she keyed the intercom to address her crew. "Gentlemen, lady, what we're about to attempt has never been tried before, probably should never be tried again, and definitely violates several laws of physics and Air Force regulations. Any of you want to voice objections now? This is the time." The intercom crackled with Santos's voice first. "Ma'am, I signed up to fix airplanes and keep crews alive. That's what I plan to do today." Pike's response came next. "I've got a daughter back home who's going to grow up hearing stories about what her mom did in the Air Force. I'd like those stories to be worth telling." The silence that followed was filled with the steady drone of 4 Allison T-56 turboprop engines, each one producing over 4,000 horsepower, and carrying them deeper into the mountains where 6 SEALs waited for a miracle. Below them, the Afghan landscape unfolded in all its harsh beauty. Snow-capped peaks that scraped the belly of heaven, valleys carved by rivers that had run since the world was young. And somewhere in that maze of rock and ice, warriors who had placed their trust in a pilot they had never met. Kess trimmed the aircraft for climb and settled back in her seat, her eyes scanning the instruments with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. The radio crackled with position, reports from other aircraft in the area. Apache gunships moving to provide close air support. A B-1 bomber holding in a racetrack pattern 30,000 feet above them, and the rescue helicopters that had already tried and failed to reach Viper Team. 23 minutes into the flight, the mountains of Kunar province began to fill the windscreen like the walls of a cathedral built by gods with a taste for violence. Kess had flown these ranges dozens of times, threading C-130s through passes that appeared on no charts and following valleys that existed more as rumors than confirmed geographical features. Today felt different, though. The peaks seemed sharper, the shadows deeper, the very air more unforgiving. "Rescue 7-4, this is Viper Lead." The voice on the radio carried the controlled tension of a professional soldier who had accepted that he might die but refused to make it easy for the enemy. "We've got your aircraft on visual. Are you seriously planning to land on this postage stamp?" Kess keyed the mic, her voice carrying just a hint of the Cherokee accent that surfaced when she was completely focused. "Viper Lead, Rescue 7-4. That's affirm. Recommend you mark the western edge of your position with smoke and clear your people back as far as possible. This is going to be interesting for everyone involved." The laughter that came back through the radio was the sound of men who had moved beyond fear into that strange realm where death becomes just another tactical consideration. "Roger that, 7-4. Viper Team is ready for pickup. Fair warning, we've got company closing from 3 directions. Estimate 15 minutes before this becomes a really unfriendly neighborhood." 15 minutes. Kess felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the predatory focus that her grandmother had recognized in a 6-year-old girl who climbed too high and dove too fearlessly. The numbers ran through her head like a mathematical prayer: approach speed, descent rate, distance to target, margin for error. Everything had to be perfect, because in 15 minutes the physics of flight would collide with the reality of combat, and only one outcome would matter. She rolled the C-130 into a steep bank, beginning the approach that would either make history or end it. While somewhere below them, 6 Navy SEALs watched the sky and trusted their lives to a pilot whose call sign had been chosen by a Cherokee grandmother who understood the hunting patterns of birds of prey. The approach began 37 miles out, with Kess rolling the C-130 into a descent profile that would have made flight instructors reach for their emergency checklist. The Hercules wasn't designed for what she was attempting. It was a cargo hauler, built for strength and reliability rather than the aerodynamic grace needed for precision approaches into impossible landing zones. But every aircraft had capabilities beyond its specifications. hidden reserves of performance that could be accessed by pilots willing to push past the safety margins written in red ink. "Crew, this is Pilot," she announced over the intercom. "Beginning combat approach. Secure all loose items and prepare for aggressive maneuvering." Her hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of a concert pianist, reducing power and configuring the aircraft for landing while simultaneously planning the three-dimensional puzzle that would get them onto the mountain shelf. Through her headset, she could hear the radio chatter from the Apache gunships that had arrived on station. "Rescue 7-4, this is Guardian 1-2. We've got eyes on multiple enemy positions surrounding your LZ. Recommend you abort this approach and let us clear the area first." "Negative, Guardian," Kess replied, her voice steady despite the fact that she was flying a 40-year-old cargo plane toward a landing zone that existed more in theory than reality. "Time is critical. Continue your runs and keep them honest, but don't stop us from getting in there." The mountain peaks rose around them like the walls of a canyon designed by a malevolent god. The GPS coordinates for Viper Team's position showed as a small square on her navigation display, but the reality visible through the cockpit windows was far more sobering. The shelf appeared to be carved from solid granite, a nearly flat section of rock that jutted out from the mountain face like an accusatory finger pointed at the sky. Santos keyed the intercom from his position behind the pilot's seats. "Kess, I'm showing some unusual readings on number 3 engine. Nothing critical yet, but the exhaust gas temperature is climbing." She glanced at the engine instruments, nodding the amber caution light that had begun blinking. In normal operations, she would have shut down the engine and returned to base. Today, with 6 SEALs counting on them and Taliban fighters closing in, normal operations were a luxury they couldn't afford. "Roger that, Chief. Monitor the situation and let me know if it gets worse." The radio crackled with Viper Lead's voice. "Rescue 7-4, we've got smoke marking the western edge of the shelf. Be advised, we're taking sporadic sniper fire from the northern ridge. Recommend you come in from the south and plan your approach accordingly." Kess studied the terrain, her pilot's eye automatically calculating angles and distances. The southern approach would require threading the C-130 between 2 peaks that rose like sentinels on either side of the valley, then dropping the aircraft toward the shelf in a descent that would test every limit of the Hercules' design envelope. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than miles, and there would be no opportunity for a go-around if the approach went wrong. "Copy all, Viper Lead. Beginning final approach now. Clear the area and keep your heads down." She rolled the aircraft into a left bank that would have made passengers reach for airsickness bags, using the terrain to mask their approach from the enemy positions that Guardian 1-2 had identified. The Hercules responded to her control inputs with the ponderous grace of a large aircraft pushed to its limits, but Kess could feel the underlying strength of the machine. 4 engines producing over 16,000 horsepower, wings designed to carry enormous loads, and a landing gear system engineered to absorb tremendous impacts. The shelf appeared in her windscreen as a narrow rectangle of brown stone against the darker granite of the mountain face. The sight that greeted her was both better and worse than she had hoped. The surface appeared relatively flat, but the length was even shorter than the satellite imagery had suggested. Her mental calculations, refined by years of landings on improvised strips in hostile territory, told her that she had perhaps 50 meters of margin for error. "Flaps 40, gear down," she called out, configuring the aircraft for landing while simultaneously planning every second of the next 3 minutes. The Hercules shuddered slightly as the landing gear extended and locked, the additional drag helping to bleed off airspeed as they descended toward the shelf. Pike's voice came through the intercom. "Ma'am, I can see the SEALs. They're positioned along the eastern edge of the shelf, and they're waving us in. There's also movement in the rocks below them. Looks like the bad guys are trying to work their way up the cliff face." The final moments of the approach compressed into a series of instantaneous decisions and corrections. The wind was gusting across the shelf, trying to push the C-130 sideways into the mountain. The number 3 engine's exhaust gas temperature had climbed into the red zone, and she could hear a subtle change in its sound that suggested they were operating on borrowed time. The Taliban fighters below were close enough that she could see muzzle flashes winking among the rocks. None of that mattered now. The only thing that existed was the narrow rectangle of stone rushing toward them, and the 6 men whose lives depended on her ability to place 97 feet of wingspan and 150,000 pounds of aircraft exactly where it needed to be. The main landing gear touched down with a jar that rattled every rivet in the airframe, followed immediately by the nose wheel, as Kess planted the Hercules onto the mountain shelf, with the authority of a pilot who had learned to land by watching hawks dive for prey. The reverse thrust from 4 turboprop engines howled across the granite as she stood on the brakes, using every technique she had ever learned to stop the aircraft before it ran out of mountain. 80 meters from the western edge of the shelf, with the cliff face yawning before them like an open mouth, the C-130 Hercules shuddered to a complete stop. For a moment that lasted forever, the only sounds were the tick of cooling metal and the distant crack of rifle fire as the Apache continued their gun runs against the Taliban positions below. Then the cargo door began to open, and 6 Navy SEALs ran toward salvation with the urgency of men who had looked death in the face and refused to blink first. The SEALs came aboard with the fluid efficiency of elite operators who had practiced emergency extractions until the movements became muscle memory. Viper Lead was the last through the cargo door, his eyes meeting Pike's as she helped him secure his wounded teammate. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had taken a rifle round through his left shoulder, but his grip was strong as he shook Pike's hand. "Ma'am," Webb said through gritted teeth, "I don't know what kind of pilot you've got up front, but that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Pike smiled as she strapped him into the cargo net seats they had rigged along the aircraft's centerline. "Sergeant, you haven't seen anything yet. The landing was the easy part." Viper Lead, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Cross, made his way forward to the cockpit as Pike secured the rest of his team. At 32, Cross had spent more time in hostile territory than most people spent at their day jobs, and his calm demeanor in the face of certain death had earned him the respect of every operator who had served with him. When he spoke, it was with the quiet authority of someone who had led men through impossible situations and brought them home alive. "Captain Thorne," he said, extending his hand to Kess, "Chief Cross, SEAL Team 3, I want you to know that what you just did, there aren't words for it." Kess shook his hand while simultaneously monitoring the engine instruments and calculating their options for departure. Number 3 engine was definitely running hot, and the gauge readings suggested they were operating on borrowed time. The Taliban fighters below had regrouped from the Apache attacks and were working their way up the cliff face toward the shelf. In perhaps 10 minutes, this narrow outcropping of granite would become a very unhealthy place for a stationary aircraft. "Chief, I'm glad we could get you out," she replied, "but we're not clear yet. I need your team to brace for some unconventional maneuvering. What we're about to do has never been attempted with a C-130, and I'm making it up as we go along." Cross studied her face, reading the focused intensity that had carried her through the impossible landing. "Ma'am, my team has been in worse situations than this. We trust your judgment completely." Santos keyed the intercom from his position at the flight engineer panel. "Kess, number 3 is showing definite signs of distress. We've got maybe 15 minutes before that engine decides to quit being cooperative." She nodded, her hands already moving across the controls as she prepared for a departure that would either establish a new chapter in Air Force legend or create a smoking crater on an Afghan mountainside. The mathematics were brutally simple. The shelf was too short for a conventional takeoff. The surrounding terrain made a normal climb impossible, and they were carrying more weight than the aircraft specifications recommended for high-altitude operations. "Chief Cross," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. How do you and your team feel about flying?" The SEAL's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "Ma'am, we jump out of perfectly good airplanes for a living. I think we can handle whatever you've got planned." Kess felt the predatory focus settling over her again, the transformation that turned her from a person into a weapons system calibrated for precision and timing. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Little Kestrel, the secret of hunting is knowing when to dive and when to ride the thermals. The mountain gives lift to those who understand its moods." "Crew, this is Pilot," she announced over the intercom. "Secure for emergency departure. What we're about to attempt is technically impossible, definitely dangerous, and probably stupid. But it's also the only chance we've got." She released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward, feeling 4 turboprop engines, 3 healthy and 1 protesting, begin to pull the C-130 across the granite shelf. The aircraft accelerated slowly at first, fighting the thin mountain air and the enormous weight of fuel and passengers, but gradually building speed as the propellers bit into the atmosphere with increasing authority. 50 meters from the edge of the cliff, Kess pulled the yoke back and felt the Hercules reluctantly lift off the mountain shelf. For a moment that lasted forever, they hung in the air above the abyss, too slow to fly and too committed to land, balanced on the knife edge between controlled flight and gravity's inevitable victory. That's when the mountain gave them its gift. The thermal updraft that rose from the sun-heated valley below caught the C-130's wings like invisible hands, providing the lift that physics textbooks said shouldn't exist. Kess felt the aircraft respond to the rising air, the vertical speed indicator showing a climb rate that should have been impossible for their weight and altitude. She had found the thermal her grandmother had told her about, the invisible river of rising air that hawks used to soar effortlessly above the world. But thermals were fickle things, and this one would only carry them so far. As the C-130 climbed away from the mountain shelf, Kess began a gentle turn toward the south, using the aircraft's momentum and the mountain's gift to carry them toward safety. Behind them, Taliban fighters reached the empty shelf and stood staring at the sky, wondering how a cargo plane the size of a building had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. The flight back to Bagram passed in a blur of radio calls and position reports, with Apache gunships providing escort and medical personnel standing by for Webb's wounded shoulder. But for Kess, the return journey was marked by a different kind of awareness, the gradual understanding that she had just accomplished something that would echo through Air Force history long after her own flying days were over. As the landing gear touched down on Bagram's familiar runway, she could see crowds of personnel gathered outside the operations center. Word of the mission had spread through the base with the speed that only truly extraordinary events achieved. Colonel Martinez was there, along with generals she didn't recognize and camera crews that would record her words for posterity. But all of that would come later. For now, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed, and 7 good men who would go home to their families, because a pilot had learned to fly by watching birds of prey hunt in impossible places. The debriefing lasted 4 hours and involved more general officers than Kess had ever seen in one room. The video footage from the Apache gunships had captured most of the landing and takeoff, providing documentation of maneuvers that would be studied in flight schools for decades to come. The tactical analysts were already working on after-action reports that would classify the mission at levels requiring congressional oversight, while the intelligence officers processed the information that Viper team had died trying to protect. Through it all, Kess sat quietly at the conference table, answering questions with the matter-of-fact precision that had characterized her entire military career. Yes, she had known the risks. No, she hadn't consulted any manual for the procedures she'd used. Yes, She would do it again under similar circumstances. The bureaucratic machinery of the military was already grinding into motion, processing paperwork for decorations and commendations that would formally recognize what everyone in the room already understood. Major Hutchinson waited until the last general had left before approaching her table. "Kess," he said quietly, "I've been flying for 24 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off today. That thermal you caught coming off the shelf. How did you know it would be there?" She looked up from the incident report she'd been writing, her eyes carrying the quiet confidence that had sustained her through every impossible mission she'd ever flown. "Sir, my grandmother taught me to watch hawks when I was